Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something a little different. Let's talk about contraception, but not the modern kind you're used to. Nope, tonight we're going back, way back to ancient Rome. Picture this, it's a warm evening in a bustling Roman city. You're walking down a crowded cobblestone street, the sound of sandals tapping against stone echoing in the air, as you pass by market stalls selling all sorts of spices, fabrics, and odd little trinkets. But, hidden amongst these ordinary daily scenes, there's a fascinating story lurking in the shadows of Roman life. You see, ancient Romans had some surprisingly creative methods of contraception. Now, before you get any funny ideas, let's just say, the Romans didn't exactly have the luxury of modern science. No fancy pills, no IUDs, just good old-fashioned trial and error. And trust me, their ideas might make you laugh, raise an eyebrow, or even cringe. But that's exactly why it's worth exploring. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is in your city. I'm always curious to know who's tuning in. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's hard to imagine a time when contraception wasn't as straightforward as it is now. In fact, back in ancient Rome, it was a whole different ballgame. The Romans didn't have access to the kind of scientific knowledge that we have today. No one was walking around with textbooks on human biology, let alone Google to look things up. Yet, somehow, they figured out how to manage pregnancy in ways that might seem, well, a bit out there for us today. But here's the thing. Contraception in Rome wasn't just a matter of science, it was also a matter of survival, status, and sometimes superstition. Life back then was tough. The Roman Empire was huge, sprawling from Britain to the Middle East, and whether you were a noblewoman or a poor plebeian, keeping the family size manageable was no easy feat. You didn't have the luxury of family planning clinics or a local pharmacy stocked with options. Romans turned to a mix of practical, sometimes bizarre methods to avoid unwanted pregnancies. Most of these methods were passed down orally through families or social groups, meaning that while some might have been effective, others, well, let's just say they weren't exactly scientifically proven. One of the most common approaches involved using plants and herbs. Roman women, and even men, were keenly aware of the power of nature's medicine cabinet. While we think of herbal medicine today as something for minor ailments, back then, it was often seen as the first line of defense against unwanted pregnancy. Some of these plants were known for their ability to alter hormonal balances, while others were thought to block conception through their toxic properties. The most common contraceptive herbs included things like silphium, which unfortunately became extinct by the honest century AD. It was so highly valued that it was worth its weight in silver. Talk about supply and demand. Other plants included pennyroyal and rue, both of which had strong, pungent smells and were known for their medicinal properties. These plants were often used in teas or oils, applied to the body in hopes of preventing pregnancy, and the Romans didn't stop there. They also relied on more unconventional substances. Ever heard of crocodile dung? That's right. Some Roman women used this, along with other animal byproducts, as a form of contraception, thinking it would block sperm from reaching the egg. Was it effective? Well, historians are still debating that one. Some argue it was nothing more than a superstition, while others think there might have been a small amount of truth in the idea. Now, before you start laughing, I have to say, ancient Roman contraceptive practices were not without their practical roots. The Romans understood the importance of controlling reproduction for both economic and social reasons. While elite families sought to limit the number of children to maintain their wealth and power, lower-class families had their own reasons for controlling the number of mouths to feed. But let's not forget that the role of women in this process was often dictated by their status and place in society. The elite Roman women, who were part of the upper crust, had a certain degree of freedom in choosing whether or not they wanted children. But for many Roman women, particularly those of lower classes or slaves, the idea of choosing when to have children wasn't so much a right as it was a necessity for survival. This is where we start to see the intertwining of contraception and social class. Contraception wasn't just a personal decision, it was tied to a woman's place in Roman society. For some women, the ability to control reproduction was a form of power. For others, it was a matter of survival. In many cases, contraception wasn't just a private matter, it could be a community affair too. Women often relied on word-of-mouth advice from friends, family, and even herbalists who had a reputation for curing everything from fertility issues to unwanted pregnancies. In some cases, it might have been more about superstition than anything else. If you believed a certain ritual or plant could work, then you'd swear by it, even if science might tell you otherwise. And while there's no clear-cut answer as to how effective these methods were, one thing is certain: the ancient Romans had a surprising amount of knowledge when it came to managing fertility. Despite not having the science we rely on today, they had a deep understanding of their bodies and the world around them. Alright, let's dive deeper into the wonderful world of Roman contraceptive methods. Picture this. You're in a Roman apothecary, the shelves stacked high with jars of strange herbs and powders. The air smells like a mix of dried plants, wax, and something a bit pungent. You're here for one thing: to pick up the latest miracle herb to prevent pregnancy. Now, before you get too excited about ancient apothecaries, let me just warn you, the medicine here was as weird as it was creative. The ancient Romans had a fascinating relationship with plants. You see, they didn't have access to the modern tools we take for granted today, like birth control pills or latex. No, they relied on what nature provided, and some of their methods were, let's say, a little on the experimental side. It's like they were the OG biohackers, only they didn't quite know what a placebo effect was. One of the more popular herbs for contraception was silphium. Now, this wasn't just any plant. In fact, it was so popular in ancient times that it became one of the most sought-after commodities in the Roman Empire. It was said to have the power to prevent pregnancy, regulate menstruation, and even be used as an abortifacient. That's a big deal, right? You'd think we'd still have this magical plant around today, but, unfortunately, silphium was harvested to extinction by the Unis century AD. It was so valuable that its image was even stamped on coins. Imagine that a plant so important, it was immortalized in Roman currency. With silphium gone, Romans didn't just give up. They moved on to other, less glamorous options. One of the most common replacements was pennyroyal, a strong-smelling herb that was supposed to work by causing contractions and regulating menstruation. But, and this is important, pennyroyal is actually toxic in large doses. So, while it was a popular method, it was also a risky one. A woman might have ended up with more than just an upset stomach if she wasn't careful. Pennyroyal could be lethal. But hey, the Romans didn't have the luxury of modern toxicology tests, so trial and error were just part of the process. Another herb commonly used was rue. This plant was known for its medicinal properties and was believed to help with various issues, including contraception. Rue was often used in a similar way to pennyroyal, applied as a poultice or taken in teas. It had a bitter taste, but hey, when your choices are limited, you learn to tolerate a little bitterness, right? Now, don't think these herbal remedies were just something women popped into their morning tea. Oh no, contraception in ancient Rome was as much about rituals and superstitions as it was about plants. In fact, some Roman women believed that performing specific rituals while using these herbs would make the methods even more effective. For example, some women would wear amulets made of certain metals or stones, believing they had protective properties. Others might recite prayers or incantations to invoke the favor of certain gods, hoping that divine intervention would add an extra layer of protection. Interestingly, some Roman physicians also recommended using animal products as contraception. Yes, you heard me right. You see, ancient Roman physicians were all about the holistic approach, blending medicine with the mystical. One of the most peculiar methods involved using crocodile dung as a form of barrier contraception. The idea was that the dung, when inserted into the body, would somehow block sperm from reaching the egg. Did it work? Well, it's a mystery for the ages. Some modern historians have raised an eyebrow at the concept, suggesting that it was more about superstition than science. But don't think the Romans were just playing around with poop, even if it sounds like it. They were also keen on using things like sponges as barriers. These sponges were often soaked in vinegar or other substances and then inserted into the vagina, acting as a sort of physical barrier to prevent pregnancy. It wasn't exactly the most comfortable option, but it was an option nonetheless. Now, here's the kicker. The more you read about ancient Roman contraception, the more you realize just how creative, or maybe desperate, the Romans got when it came to preventing pregnancy. They tried everything, from herbal concoctions to bizarre animal products to even some early versions of what might be considered a barrier method today. In some ways, they were ahead of their time, experimenting with ideas that modern medicine wouldn't touch for centuries. But, and this is where the whole thing gets a little sticky, there was also a significant cultural aspect to all of this. You see, contraception in ancient Rome wasn't just about personal health, it was deeply tied to social class, gender roles, and even religion. Women's bodies, their fertility, and their ability to control reproduction were often seen through the lens of society's expectations. For instance, wealthy Roman women might have more access to contraceptive methods, while lower-class women had fewer options and often had to rely on whatever they could afford or get their hands on. And then, there's the religious aspect. Many Roman deities were believed to have control over fertility. The goddess Juno, for example, was seen as the protector of women and childbirth, while Venus was the goddess of love and sexuality. Women might invoke these deities for protection against unwanted pregnancies, much like modern-day couples might wish for a blessing or use a good luck charm before starting a family. The connection between religion and contraception in ancient Rome was an intriguing mix of the divine and the practical. But here's the twist. Historians still debate whether any of these methods truly worked. Some argue that the herbal remedies were somewhat effective, while others think the entire practice was just rooted in superstition. And as for the animal dung, well, let's just say it's one of those things we might never fully understand. Now that we've explored the wild world of Roman herbs and remedies, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the Romans' approach to actual contraceptive devices. That's right, while they didn't have latex or plastic like we do today, ancient Romans weren't completely without creative solutions when it came to physical barriers. Their tools might not look anything like what you'd find in modern pharmacies, but hey, they made do with what they had. Let's start with the barrier method, and no, not the kind we use today. The Romans actually had some pretty interesting ideas when it came to physical contraceptives, many of which involved using natural materials. In fact, they were somewhat ahead of their time in that they recognized that blocking sperm from entering the body was a key part of contraception. They didn't have the kind of medical knowledge we have now, but somehow they understood that if you could prevent sperm from reaching the egg, you could prevent pregnancy. One of the earliest forms of barrier contraception in Rome was the sponge method. Before you think of something out of a cleaning supplies aisle, let me clarify. This sponge wasn't just for wiping up spills. The Romans used it in a very specific way, soaked in a mixture of vinegar, or sometimes a combination of vinegar and honey. The sponge was inserted into the vagina before intercourse. The idea was that the sponge would act as a physical barrier to block the sperm, while the vinegar, and sometimes honey, would kill or neutralize the sperm. Sounds a bit like an ancient DIY contraceptive, right? It's fascinating when you think about it all. Though the Romans didn't have the science behind it, they were basically trying to create their own version of a diaphragm. The sponge method was not only practical, but also a bit resourceful. Of course, the efficacy of this method is still up for debate. Historians haven't exactly agreed on how well it worked. But one thing is clear. It shows that the ancient Romans were not short on innovation when it came to controlling fertility. And if you're thinking, okay, but surely the Romans didn't stop there, right? You're right, they didn't. The condom in some form was also on their radar. Now, I'm not talking about the latex kind, obviously, but Roman men were known to use animal bladders or intestines as primitive versions of condoms. I know, it sounds a bit grim, but the practice was actually quite common in ancient times. These makeshift condoms were often used to prevent the spread of disease, which, by the way, was probably just as important as preventing pregnancy back then, and to block sperm from reaching the egg. Imagine that: no modern packaging, no sleek designs, just an actual animal intestine. And while it may not have been the most glamorous of contraceptive options, it was effective for the time. Now, if you're starting to feel a little squeamish, I totally get it. It's one thing to read about it in a textbook, but thinking about it in the context of Roman life can make you wonder just how desperate they were to find a solution. But at the same time, you can't help but appreciate their resourcefulness. They were working with what they had, experimenting with materials, and learning as they went. On the flip side, while barrier methods like sponges and animal products were being experimented with, there were still plenty of superstitions and rituals that played a big role in contraception. The idea that spiritual or mystical practices could enhance contraceptive methods wasn't exactly new. In fact, many Roman women believed that wearing amulets or charms made of particular metals, stones, or even certain herbs could ward off pregnancy. These objects weren't just fashionable, they were thought to have protective properties, keeping unwanted pregnancies at bay. Imagine a Roman woman walking around in a gown, her neck adorned with an amulet made of amethyst, a stone that was believed to have fertility-blocking powers. Or perhaps she wore a simple metal coin engraved with symbols dedicated to Venus or Diana, hoping that these gods and goddesses would grant her protection from conception. It wasn't exactly a guarantee, but in a world where the supernatural and the natural were deeply intertwined, these small charms offered a sense of control over an unpredictable and often dangerous aspect of life. But here's where things get even more interesting. Romans didn't just rely on objects or herbs. They also turned to magic. Yes, magic. Rituals, incantations, and spells were part of daily life, and some women believed that invoking certain deities or spirits would help prevent pregnancy. For instance, some women might recite prayers to Juno, the goddess of women and childbirth, asking her to ensure that their wombs remained closed for the time being. Others might whisper a chant while applying their herbal concoctions, as if the mere act of speaking a magical word could seal their fate. The combination of ritual and natural remedies in ancient Roman contraception reveals just how entwined these methods were with everyday life. It wasn't just about using a certain plant or inserting a barrier. It was about invoking the powers of the divine and the mysteries of nature to ensure that a woman's body could maintain control over its own fertility. This was, after all, a society that believed the gods had dominion over almost every part of human existence, from love and war to health and death. And here's a fun fact. Historians still argue whether these magical practices were actually effective or if they were more about psychological comfort. Some believe that the belief in these rituals gave women a sense of empowerment, allowing them to feel like they had some control over their fertility, even if the actual methods didn't always work. Now, if you think about it, the sheer variety of methods the Romans employed, ranging from herbs to sponges, from animal products to amulet tells you just how serious they were about preventing pregnancy. They didn't just wait for someone to invent the pill, they were ahead of their time in experimenting and seeking out ways to manage reproduction. Now that we've uncovered the world of physical contraceptive methods and magical rituals, let's take a step back and look at the broader implications of contraception in Roman society. As you might imagine, controlling fertility wasn't just a personal choice, it was deeply intertwined with social class, gender roles, and even the political structure of the Roman Empire. That's right. In ancient Rome, your ability to manage reproduction wasn't simply a private matter. It had everything to do with your place in society. For the wealthy, especially the upper-class Roman women, controlling fertility was often a matter of preserving family wealth and maintaining social status. If you were a wealthy Roman woman, you had the luxury of controlling the size of your family, ensuring that you didn't have too many mouths to feed or too many heirs fighting over your estate. The importance of family lineage and inheritance meant that Roman families were keenly aware of the number of children they had, especially since the survival rates of children in ancient Rome were notoriously low. But what about the lower classes, or even slaves? Well, things were a bit more complicated. For many lower-class women, contraception wasn't so much about personal choice as it was about survival. In a society where survival was already difficult, especially in poverty-stricken areas, having too many children could be an overwhelming burden. Contraceptive methods for these women weren't necessarily about maintaining a lavish lifestyle or controlling inheritance. They were often about ensuring that they could feed and clothe the children they already had. In fact, some historians argue that Roman contraception methods were more prevalent among the lower classes than the wealthy, especially when it came to non-herbal methods like the use of sponges or animal products. These lower-class women didn't have access to the fancy apothecaries or costly herbs that their elite counterparts could afford. Instead, they relied on whatever resources they could find in their environment: sponges from the sea, animal bladders from butcher shops, and a mix of folk remedies passed down from one generation to the next. But of course, women weren't the only ones involved in these decisions. In ancient Rome, men held a great deal of power when it came to reproduction. In fact, many Roman men were heavily invested in controlling the fertility of their wives, concubines, or slaves, particularly since the men often held the key to the family's wealth and legacy. Women's bodies weren't necessarily their own when it came to reproduction more often than not. They were considered tools for producing heirs or securing the family's status in Roman society. This brings us to another fascinating aspect of Roman contraception: the role of masculine authority in regulating reproduction. In a male-dominated society like Rome, men were often the ones who decided whether or not a woman could use contraception. This meant that a Roman woman's ability to avoid pregnancy depended largely on her husband's or her master's permission. A wealthy man might allow his wife to use contraception to prevent too many children from interrupting his business or political career. However, a poor man may have had no say at all, and a slave woman had no choice in the matter whatsoever. Here's where things get even more layered. Contraception was also used to protect men's sexual pleasure. In Roman society, sexuality was often seen as a masculine pursuit. Men were expected to be sexually active, and this activity often extended beyond their wives to include concubines and prostitutes. For these men, contraception wasn't just about preventing pregnancy, it was also about maintaining their sexual freedom while avoiding the consequences of their actions. This may explain why many of the more bizarre contraceptive methods, such as animal bladders or animal dung, were designed with the male experience in mind. It wasn't just about preventing pregnancy, it was about maintaining control over sexual encounters with little to no consequences for the men involved. At the same time, the Roman social structure was rigid when it came to class and gender. Women, especially those of lower social standing, often had limited options when it came to contraception. Some may have resorted to using whatever methods were available, while others might have taken part in secretive or illegal practices to avoid unwanted pregnancies. For example, many Roman prostitutes, whose livelihoods depended on maintaining their attractiveness and health, were known to use some of the more effective methods of contraception available, often in secret. Despite the often public nature of their work, these women had more control over their fertility than many other women in Roman society. But even as we talk about the social implications of contraception, there's one thing we can't ignore: the religious influence. In Roman culture, fertility was not just a physical phenomenon, it was also a divine one. Gods and goddesses played a significant role in the way the Romans viewed sexuality, love, and reproduction. Venus, the goddess of love, and Juno, the goddess of marriage and childbirth, were invoked by women seeking protection from pregnancy or desiring help with fertility issues. The belief in the supernatural and the role of the gods added an extra layer of complexity to Roman contraception. Women didn't just seek physical remedies, they also sought divine favor. Interestingly, some Romans believed that certain charms or amulets could protect a woman from pregnancy. These charms were often carried by women as a form of protection, much like modern-day talismans or lucky charms. It's almost as though the Romans had their own version of faith-based contraception, relying not only on herbal remedies or physical barriers, but also on the belief that the gods would intervene to help them out. However, like much of Roman life, the truth is that there was no one-size-fits-all answer when it came to contraception. It was a matter of personal circumstance, social class, gender, and even religious beliefs played a huge role in the methods people used or didn't use. Historians still argue over how effective these methods truly were. Did the Roman contraceptive techniques actually work, or were they more about belief and cultural practices? It's a question that has yet to be fully answered, but one thing is certain: the Romans were incredibly resourceful, and their experimentation with contraception was as varied and fascinating as their society itself. As we've seen, contraception in ancient Rome wasn't just a private matter, it was deeply intertwined with the social fabric, from the rich elites to the poorest slaves. Now, let's talk about how contraception spread across different layers of Roman society and how it became an almost underground phenomenon for certain classes. Despite the Roman Empire's grand architecture, its sophisticated governance, and its military prowess, some things were simply too personal, too private, to be openly discussed, and contraception was certainly one of them. Roman society was deeply divided by class. There were the patricians, the upper class, and then the plebeians, the common folk. But even among these groups, there were subtler distinctions. Some families were so wealthy that they lived in large villas, enjoying all the luxuries Roman civilization had to offer, while others barely scraped by, living in crowded, rickety apartment blocks called insulae. And yet, despite these differences, many of the common methods of contraception became shared across the classes though, as with everything else in Roman life, the quality and accessibility of these methods varied greatly. Among the wealthy elite, contraception was more likely to be sought from well-established physicians or apothecaries. These individuals were often wealthy themselves and had access to expensive herbs and materials that were not available to the average Roman. While we've already discussed how herbs like silphium were used, wealthy women often had access to better quality and more refined remedies. In fact, elite women may have had their own personal physicians who provided these services, ensuring that they could control the number of children in the family. For the lower classes, however, contraception was more likely to be a matter of necessity than convenience. Lower class women, including slaves, didn't have the luxury of visiting a personal doctor. Instead, they relied on folk remedies passed down through generations. These methods were often shared within close-knit communities, particularly among women who worked together or lived in the same neighborhood. Imagine a group of Roman women sitting together in a small, dimly lit room, chatting as they passed along the latest contraceptive tips that were as practical as they were experimental. These would often include home remedies like pennyroyal tea, or even using a mix of animal products like crocodile dung. But this wasn't just about survival. It was about community and support, as these women would help each other navigate the challenging realities of reproduction in a world where medical care was scarce. In fact, some of these remedies may have been handed down as part of secret knowledge passed on only from one woman to another. These methods weren't written down in official medical texts, but were instead whispered in the streets, exchanged in private. The secrecy of contraception among the lower classes was not only practical but also tied to shame. Contraception was not openly discussed, especially among the upper class, and this created a kind of quiet, underground network where women could share information without fear of social ostracism. This underground nature of contraception in Rome was particularly evident in places like brothels, where women's livelihoods depended on maintaining their health and avoiding pregnancy. Brothels, as strange as it may sound, were a place where contraception was actively practiced and where methods were constantly tested and refined. Roman prostitutes, many of whom worked in large lupanaria, official brothels, had to be especially cautious about pregnancies. Their work was not only a matter of sexual service, it was also about maintaining their attractiveness and health for the men who visited. Contraception wasn't just an option for these women, it was essential for their survival in the business. They needed to remain fit, available, and fertile, just not in the way society expected. Some of these women turned to herbalists or local midwives who specialized in these kinds of clandestine services. A midwife might suggest the use of a herbal sponge soaked in a potent mix of ingredients, or perhaps even a special potion to drink that would close the womb after intercourse. These methods weren't just about avoiding unwanted pregnancies, they were also about ensuring that the women involved could continue their work without the interruption of an unplanned pregnancy. Historians still debate the effectiveness of these underground practices. Some argue that these methods were successful in preventing pregnancy, while others think that many of these women relied more on luck and faith than on any actual medical efficacy. Regardless of the success rate, the social networks built around contraception in these spaces were incredibly important. These women formed strong bonds, shared vital knowledge, and even exchanged recipes for different kinds of potions or barriers that could help them maintain their work. Meanwhile, among the upper-class Romans, contraception was likely a more regulated affair. Wealthy families could afford the luxury of choosing when to have children, and as we discussed before, they had access to better remedies and more reliable information. But here's the catch. Even for the rich, there was still a sense of shame when it came to openly discussing contraception. You didn't want to be seen as someone who couldn't produce heirs for your family line, or as someone who avoided pregnancy out of personal choice. While Roman women had some degree of control over their reproduction, it was a delicate balance. Their choices were often dictated by the whims of their husbands, their families, and society's expectations of them as women. But still, the reality is that contraception in ancient Rome was much more than just a series of herbal remedies or physically invasive methods. It was an integral part of society for the elite. It helped maintain family wealth. For the poor, it was about survival, and for the sex workers, it was about preserving their livelihood. Despite the sometimes crude and superstitious nature of these methods, contraception was a central part of everyday Roman life, and in many ways, it was a vital part of maintaining the social order. Now that we've uncovered how contraception played a role across different Roman social classes, it's time to explore an even more fascinating aspect of this ancient practice: the connection between contraception and Roman religion. Yes, you heard that right. Roman religion, with its multitude of gods and goddesses, had a significant influence on how people thought about and approached fertility. The Romans didn't see reproduction just as a biological process. They believed it was tied to divine will and protection. So, let's step into the world of Roman spirituality, where magic, rituals, and divine intervention all mix together to influence contraception. First, let's talk about the big names, the goddesses who were believed to govern fertility and sexuality. One of the most significant was Juno, the goddess of marriage, childbirth, and fertility. Roman women would often invoke her protection when it came to all matters related to reproduction. In fact, some Roman women might have worn Juno's amulets, hoping for her favor to prevent unwanted pregnancies or to ensure a healthy childbirth. For these women, the idea of divine favor wasn't just a nice-to-have, it was a crucial part of their reproductive health. They weren't just using herbal remedies or physical barriers, they were seeking blessings from the gods to control their fertility. Then there's Venus, the goddess of love and beauty. Venus wasn't just about romance, she was also tied to sexuality and, by extension, reproduction. Women seeking to prevent pregnancy might also invoke Venus's name, hoping that her powers would help them maintain control over their bodies. But Venus wasn't just a goddess of romantic love. She also represented sexual pleasure and the freedom that came with it. For Roman men and women, invoking Venus was often a way to ensure they could engage in the pleasures of sex without the consequences of pregnancy. But the religious connection didn't end there. The Romans also practiced certain fertility rituals and incantations that were believed to enhance the effectiveness of their contraceptive methods. These weren't your run-of-the-mill, wishful thinking prayers. No, these were highly specific, carefully crafted rituals that incorporated physical actions, such as using particular herbs in particular ways as well as spoken words. It was believed that these rituals would invoke the favor of the gods, ensuring that the contraception would work as intended. Some even went so far as to make offerings or sacrifices to gods like Juno and Venus, asking them for their divine intervention in keeping their wombs closed or making sure that pregnancy wouldn't come to pass. But here's the interesting part. Historians still argue how seriously the Romans took these rituals. Were they just superstitions, or did people actually believe that these gods and goddesses could influence their fertility in any tangible way? The truth is, we'll probably never know for sure. Some historians suggest that the rituals were part of a larger system of psychological comfort, a way for Roman women to feel empowered and in control of their fertility, even if the methods themselves weren't scientifically effective. It might have been the equivalent of today's good luck charms or rituals we perform when we're about to face a big test or important event. The belief in divine help, paired with the comfort of ritual, might have been just as important as the actual contraceptive methods themselves. One of the more curious aspects of Roman religion in relation to contraception was the role of magic. Magic and ritual were deeply ingrained in Roman society, and many people believed that spells could influence everything from love and marriage to health and even fertility. Women sometimes sought out magicians or sorcerers to help them with their reproductive health, hoping that a well-spoken spell or magical incantation would prevent pregnancy. These magical practices were often associated with mysterious underground traditions similar to how we think of alternative medicine or folk healing today. If someone needed help with contraception, they might turn to these hidden practices to get the extra boost they thought they needed. But what's fascinating about all of this is how it blends science with the supernatural. Roman women didn't just rely on herbs like pennyroyal or sponges. They also sought divine assistance, creating an integrated approach to fertility control that combined physical remedies with magical and religious beliefs. It wasn't enough to just use a barrier method or take a medicinal potion. There had to be a spiritual component to complete the process. They believed that their bodies weren't just biological vessels. They were under the influence of powerful gods and forces. So, the more rituals, prayers, and offerings they made, the more likely they felt it was that their contraception would work. Interestingly, the religious aspect of contraception also highlights a unique gender dynamic in Roman society. While women were certainly at the heart of reproduction and family planning, the male gods had a strong presence in the world of Roman fertility rituals. The god Priapus, for example, was the god of male fertility, but also of protection, particularly in preventing unwanted pregnancies. Priapus, often depicted with exaggerated genitalia, was also associated with guarding gardens, and by extension, guarding against unwanted pregnancies. Some Roman women might have sought his favor to prevent conception, seeing him as a protector not only of the garden, but also of their personal lives. While these rituals were integral to some Romans' understanding of contraception, it's important to remember that not all Romans were actively involved in this type of religious fertility practice. Elite women who might have had better access to medical care might have turned more to physical methods and left the divine to those who needed extra protection. But for the average Roman, especially the lower-class women or slaves, magic and religion provided a comforting safety net for their often risky and uncertain methods of contraception. And here's the kicker. Historians are still unsure how widely these religious and magical practices were actually followed. Were they just symbolic acts, or did people genuinely believe that their fate lay in the hands of the gods? It's one of those questions that may never have a definitive answer, but it certainly adds a fascinating layer to our understanding of Roman life. All right, let's shift gears a bit and talk about something that might make you chuckle, or possibly cringe: the bizarre, the quirky, and the downright weird contraceptive methods the Romans used in their homes. While many people today are familiar with modern birth control, back then, people had to get really creative. Ancient Roman households were no exception when it came to trying out some, shall we say, unconventional methods to prevent pregnancy. First off, let's talk about home remedies. Roman women were resourceful, and they weren't afraid to experiment. After all, when you don't have access to the pharmaceutical companies we rely on today, you do the best with what you've got. And sometimes, that meant using the strangest combinations of substances to try to get the job done. Take, for instance, the use of pessaries. These were not your typical contraceptive devices, mind you. Ancient Roman pessaries were made from a variety of materials like honey, resins, bark, and sometimes animal fats. The idea was that these materials would act as a barrier or create a hostile environment for sperm. It's kind of like a DIY tampon mixed with a bit of magic. And yes, while some of these might have had some potential to block sperm or create an acidic environment that could kill sperm, the ingredients involved are, well, let's just say it's questionable whether they were anything close to effective. But, like everything in ancient medicine, it was a combination of trial and error. If it worked, great. If not, well, let's try something else. Another favorite in the Roman home contraceptive toolkit was the vaginal pessary made of acacia gum, which was often used to block the entrance to the cervix. Some ancient Roman texts suggest that this method was quite popular in preventing conception, though the success rate is anyone's guess. Can you imagine a woman back in the day mixing up all these random substances in her kitchen, hoping to hit the jackpot? Honestly, it's kind of amazing that anyone even survived the process. But wait, we're not done with weird household remedies just yet. Let's talk about silk threads. Yes, you read that right. Some ancient Roman women used silk threads as a form of contraception, carefully tying them into knots before intercourse in a bid to keep things from getting too productive. There's still a lot of debate among historians about whether these threads actually served any purpose beyond being an early form of psychological comfort, but let's just say, it probably didn't do much in terms of physical prevention. Then there's the whole mysterious fluids phase in Roman contraceptive history. Some women believed that mixing certain fluids, like vinegar and olive oil, created a kind of magic potion that would act as an internal cleanser, protecting against pregnancy. They didn't exactly know about things like pH levels and sperm viability, but it's clear that they were trying their best to make sure there was no unwanted reproduction going on in the family. Let's just say that today, this would be considered questionable at best. But who knows? Maybe some of these concoctions had a tiny bit of success in certain cases. You can't talk about Roman home remedies without mentioning spices. Yes, the Romans had a whole range of spices that they believed had contraceptive properties. Some of these included caraway seeds, dill, and rosemary, things that were thought to have the ability to stop conception. Roman women might sprinkle these into their food or use them in herbal concoctions. While the effectiveness of these spices is still up for debate, most historians think they were just placebos. There's no denying the ingenuity of the Romans when it came to fertility control. Here's the catch, though. The effectiveness of these methods was as inconsistent as the recipes themselves. Historians still argue over whether these remedies worked or were purely symbolic acts. The truth is, it's hard to gauge how successful these home-based contraceptive practices were. Some scholars suggest that while certain remedies might have had some physical effects on fertility, others were probably just myths passed down through generations. But no matter what the result, these methods were definitely part of the cultural fabric of Roman society. It was a mix of medical trial and superstition wrapped up in a bundle of hope and ritual. However, despite the randomness and occasional absurdity of some of these methods, there's a lot to be said for how the Romans tried to control reproduction in a world where survival rates were low, and the need for family planning was crucial. The methods were as varied as Roman society itself: rich, poor, slave, free, and reflected the diverse experiences of women across the empire. Whether it was magic, herbal remedies, or pure superstition, women and men alike were finding ways to manage fertility in a world without modern medical knowledge. What's even more interesting is that, in some ways, these ancient methods helped lay the groundwork for later contraceptive development. Sure, the Romans didn't have condoms or birth control pills, but they were experimenting with blocking pregnancy in ways that modern science would one day revisit. And while some of their methods were certainly unconventional, they were nonetheless proof of the human desire to control reproduction, even in a world without the luxury of scientific understanding. They understood that, in a society where family size could dictate your place in society, fertility was something that needed to be managed, whether through herbs, rituals, or something a little stranger. Now, here's the fun part. As much as we can laugh at some of the more bizarre methods the Romans used, there's one thing we can't deny: they were innovative. They were willing to try new things, experiment, and find creative solutions to an age-old problem. Maybe they didn't get it all right, but they were ahead of their time in thinking outside the box when it came to contraception. So far, we've uncovered the fascinating world of Roman contraception, from herbs to household remedies, from magical rituals to the role of religion. But what about the historical record? You might be wondering, how do we know anything about these ancient practices? After all, the Romans didn't exactly keep journals of their contraception habits or write down how well their magic spells worked. In fact, much of what we know today comes from fragments, strange accounts, and the occasional unusual discovery. That's right, some of the most revealing insights into Roman contraception come from some of the weirdest and most awkward sources. Let's start with ancient texts. The Romans, like many ancient civilizations, loved to write everything down. But while we have some really well-preserved historical documents like those from Cicero, Pliny the Elder, and Galen, very few of these texts offer detailed accounts of contraception. That's because, like most societies, sex and reproduction were considered private matters, often tied to shame or superstition. Most of the writings about contraception that have survived come from doctors, philosophers, and priests, but even then, they tended to be vague or focused on religious practices rather than the nitty-gritty details of contraception. For example, Galen, the famous Roman physician, wrote about a variety of medical topics, including methods for preventing pregnancy. However, his writings didn't necessarily offer up the type of practical advice that women would have found useful. Instead, his works focused on more general theories about health and balance in the body. His ideas about the womb and reproduction, though groundbreaking for his time, didn't exactly go into detail about the effectiveness of specific contraceptive methods. It was more about philosophical health than any practical instructions. On the other hand, Soranus of Ephesus, a Greek physician who lived in the Roman Empire, did make some significant contributions to our understanding of ancient contraceptive practices. He wrote about birth control and abortions in his work Gynecology, where he described various methods of contraception, including herbal remedies and even the use of sponges as a form of barrier contraception. Soranus also discussed pessaries, which he described as something women could insert into the vagina to block conception. These writings provide a more clear, practical approach to ancient contraception, offering valuable insights into the methods used during the Roman period. But not all of the surviving accounts come from serious medical texts. Some of the most intriguing and, frankly, awkward records come from the world of magic and superstition. The Romans, especially the lower classes, didn't always rely on physicians for their contraceptive needs. Instead, many turned to magicians, herbalists, and even witches. Some of these practitioners left behind spells, charms, and incantations meant to influence fertility and ensure contraception. For example, one of the most famous magical texts from ancient Rome is the Carmen Astrologicum, a collection of magical spells and charms that were believed to protect against various misfortunes, including unwanted pregnancies. These spells were often incredibly specific, with instructions on how to invoke the gods and goddesses, how to use particular objects or substances, and even the right time to perform the rituals. While there's little evidence that these spells worked in the way the Romans hoped, they give us a fascinating glimpse into how deeply intertwined religion, magic, and reproductive health were in Roman society. And it wasn't just magic and medicine, there are also surprising archaeological findings that shed light on Roman contraception. Archaeologists have unearthed pessaries made of materials like acacia gum and resins in ancient Roman ruins. These physical artifacts help us understand how contraception worked in practice. It's one thing to read about it in ancient texts, but it's another thing entirely to find physical evidence of these methods, tangible proof that ancient Romans were not only talking about contraception but actively using it. In fact, the discovery of ancient contraceptive sponges in excavations of Roman villas and brothels provides the most concrete evidence of contraceptive practices. These sponges, sometimes soaked in substances like vinegar or olive oil, were used as barriers similar to modern-day sponges or even tampons. Finding these items in places like brothels and inns indicates that contraception wasn't just a private, home-based affair. It was something people were actively practicing in places where sexual activity was central to daily life. But here's where things get a little tricky: historical interpretation. Historians and archaeologists don't always agree on how to interpret these findings. Some believe that many of the methods we know about were likely experimental and probably didn't have the success rates we would expect from modern contraception. Others think that some of these practices were quite effective, even if they seem a little odd by today's standards. This is one of those areas where historians still debate the effectiveness of Roman contraception methods. Was it mostly superstition, or did these techniques actually work? It's also important to recognize that Roman views on sexuality were vastly different from modern perceptions. In the Roman world, sex wasn't seen as something solely for procreation, especially among the upper classes. It was often tied to power, pleasure, and social status. Roman men, particularly those in the upper echelons of society, were not just interested in ensuring that their wives and concubines didn't get pregnant, they were also interested in sexual freedom. Many of the contraceptive methods were designed to give men the freedom to engage in sexual activity without the consequence of creating too many heirs or risking their social standing. Interestingly, in some of the most elite circles of Roman society, contraception was treated as a form of luxury. Women of the higher classes may have had more access to physician-administered contraception, which was both a sign of wealth and status. In contrast, for lower-class women and slaves, contraception was often a matter of necessity. These women had fewer options and were more likely to rely on folk remedies or magical practices passed down through generations. Looking at all this, it's clear that the question of Roman contraception is a bit like piecing together a puzzle made of fragments. The surviving records don't give us a perfect picture, and there are many unanswered questions about how effective the methods actually were. But one thing is certain: the Romans were a society deeply concerned with fertility, reproduction, and the control of both. Whether through medical methods, magical rituals, or social practices, they found ways to manage their families and control reproduction. As we continue exploring ancient Roman contraception, it's time to examine some of the more uncomfortable truths about this topic, specifically how contraception intersected with Roman slavery and brothel culture. While we've seen that contraception was often used by the elite to preserve wealth and manage family lines for slaves and sex workers, it wasn't just about personal choice, it was often a matter of survival. Let's begin with slavery in ancient Rome, which was a huge part of the empire's economy. Slaves were property, and their lives, bodies, and even reproductive capabilities were controlled by their masters. Female slaves in particular faced incredible pressure to produce children, sometimes for the sole purpose of increasing their master's wealth. After all, children born to slaves were considered the property of the master, and each new birth increased his labor force without additional cost. Now, you might be wondering, how did contraception fit into all of this? Well, it turns out that many female slaves, especially those in the households of wealthy Roman men, had no control over their own fertility. Their masters determined whether they would have children or not, and in many cases, contraception was used to prevent unwanted pregnancies. Female slaves working in the household, particularly in the elite circles, might have been given contraception by their masters to keep their sexuality controlled and to avoid the complication of pregnancies that might threaten the master's inheritance or disrupt their schedules. Some slaves were forced to serve as wet nurses or household helpers, and the last thing their masters wanted was for them to become pregnant and unable to perform their duties. To manage this, they might have been provided with herbal remedies or even some of the same barrier methods we've discussed earlier, like sponges soaked in vinegar. But the question remains, how much agency did these women have in choosing these methods? The answer is likely very little. They were at the mercy of their masters, who controlled whether they could conceive or not, depending on the circumstances. The role of slavery in contraception was particularly evident in the brothel culture of ancient Rome. In many Roman cities, prostitution was legal, and brothels, called lupanaria, were scattered throughout the empire. These brothels were not just places of sexual pleasure, they were businesses, and the women working in them were viewed as commodities. Their ability to attract clients was tied directly to their health, fertility, and appearance. If a prostitute became pregnant, she would be unable to continue her work for months, which could mean a loss of income for both herself and the brothel owner. For these women, contraception wasn't just about avoiding unwanted pregnancies, it was about maintaining their livelihoods. In many cases, women working in the brothels had access to some of the more effective contraception methods available at the time. They might have used herbal remedies, barrier methods like the sponge, or even early versions of the condom made from animal intestines, all designed to prevent pregnancy and keep them in business. These contraceptive measures weren't just about personal choice, they were about economic necessity. Interestingly, the role of contraception in brothels also sheds light on the class divide in Roman society. While wealthy women might have been able to access more refined medical methods of contraception, prostitutes and low-status women had fewer options and had to make do with whatever was available. Some brothel owners were known to supply their workers with herbal concoctions or other rudimentary contraception methods, but there were always limitations to what could be done. It's also worth noting that while contraception was widely practiced in the brothel culture, the legal status of prostitution in Rome was a bit complicated. While prostitution was legal, it was still highly stigmatized, and there was a sense of moral judgment surrounding the women involved. Prostitutes often worked in secrecy, and the methods they used to control their fertility were often kept hidden or whispered about in the shadows. This created a discrepancy between the open use of contraception in brothels and the more secretive or taboo practices outside of them. In addition, it's important to consider the gender dynamics that shaped contraception in these settings. In many ways, Roman men had the final say in whether contraception would be used, whether in a brothel or among the elite. Men controlled the sexual activity, and the women involved were seen as tools for reproduction or sexual satisfaction. Female prostitutes, like slaves, had little to no control over whether they would bear children or continue working in their profession. For them, contraception was a means of survival, ensuring that they could keep their bodies available for work, avoid the complications of pregnancy, and maintain their livelihoods. There's one more aspect of Roman contraception that's worth mentioning: the legal and religious challenges surrounding it. While contraception wasn't illegal per se, there were still laws and moral codes that shaped how it was viewed and practiced. In particular, some Roman moralists and philosophers, such as Cicero and Augustine, took a strong stance against contraception, seeing it as an interference with the natural order of things. To them, preventing pregnancy was a violation of nature's law, and in some cases, it was seen as immoral. Yet, despite the social and moral constraints, contraception in Rome remained incredibly important. Women, whether slaves, prostitutes, or elite Roman ladies, needed a way to navigate a world where reproduction and fertility were often tied to survival, social status, and economic survival. Roman society, with all its contradictions and moral debates, was a place where contraception was a necessity, even though it wasn't always acknowledged openly. The fascinating thing is, despite the often hidden nature of these practices, history still remembers them. Today, we have records, sometimes awkward, sometimes funny, that shed light on the creative, complex, and sometimes desperate ways the Romans managed their fertility. And while their methods may seem rudimentary or even bizarre to us, they were part of a larger struggle to gain control over one of the most fundamental aspects of life. Now that we've explored how contraception in ancient Rome was practiced among different social classes, let's take a closer look at the Roman physicians and medical giants of the time who contributed to the development of contraception. While we've already seen how herbal remedies, magic, and social practices shaped Roman fertility control, there were also medical professionals who played a role in the scientific side of things, at least, by the standards of their time. Let's start with Galen, the famous Greek physician who spent much of his life in Rome and became one of the most influential figures in ancient medicine. While Galen didn't specifically focus on contraception, his contributions to medical theory and anatomy were foundational for later understanding of the human body and reproduction. His work on the circulatory system, the nervous system, and the concept of bodily humors laid the groundwork for future medical advancements. In terms of contraception, Galen believed that the reproductive organs were central to a woman's health, and he emphasized the importance of balance in the body. His theories on humors and bodily fluids were influential in Roman medicine, and although they were somewhat flawed by today's standards, they did contribute to early preventative medicine. Galen's writings on fertility hinted at some of the basic principles of birth control, although he did not offer clear, practical advice on contraception. His work likely provided a conceptual framework for later physicians who would begin to study reproduction more directly. However, it was Soranus of Ephesus, another prominent Greek physician who practiced in Rome, who made the most direct contributions to contraception in ancient Roman medicine. Soranus, known for his work on gynecology, wrote extensively about the female body and its functions. In his medical treatise, Gynecology, Soranus described various methods of preventing pregnancy, making him one of the first medical professionals to offer systematic advice on contraception. One of Soranus's most notable contributions was his recommendation of pessaries as a method of contraception. These were objects often made of plant materials or other substances that could be inserted into the vagina to block sperm from reaching the egg. Soranus suggested using vaginal suppositories as a preventive method, emphasizing their role in keeping a woman's uterus closed to fertilization. This was an early version of the barrier method, and while it was certainly rudimentary compared to modern-day techniques, it was still a significant step forward in terms of recognizing the body's reproductive processes. Soranus also described the use of herbal remedies to manage fertility, such as silphium, a plant that was highly prized in the Roman world. He believed that herbal treatments could regulate the menstrual cycle and even prevent pregnancy by altering a woman's hormonal balance. While many of these methods may seem primitive to us, they were a practical approach to contraception at the time, reflecting a growing understanding of how to control reproduction. But here's where things get interesting. Soranus, like many Roman physicians, also emphasized the moral aspect of contraception. While his methods were practical, he was also concerned with the ethical implications of controlling reproduction. He believed that contraception should only be used for health reasons, such as preventing harm to a woman's body or preserving her ability to work. In his view, it wasn't just about preventing pregnancy. It was about maintaining a woman's physical balance and well-being. This belief in medical ethics was a recurring theme among Roman physicians. They didn't always view contraception as a means of personal choice or sexual freedom. Instead, it was framed as a health intervention, one that should be used responsibly to avoid the negative consequences of uncontrolled reproduction. For many Roman doctors, contraception wasn't about empowerment or personal control, it was about maintaining health and balance within the body. Interestingly, even though Roman physicians like Soranus and Galen made significant contributions to the medical understanding of fertility and contraception, Their work was limited by the scientific knowledge of their time. They didn't have the ability to understand hormones or genetics, and their ideas about reproduction were often based on theories of the humors and vital spirits concepts that have since been debunked by modern science. Despite this, their writings had a profound influence on the development of medieval and Renaissance medicine, and some of their ideas about contraception would carry forward into later centuries. But, as with most medical knowledge in ancient Rome, there were limitations to what the physicians could offer. While their advice and remedies were more sophisticated than folk remedies or magical charms, they were still based on an understanding of the body that was incomplete. For instance, many Roman physicians believed that the womb was a separate entity with its own set of rules and behaviors, and they didn't understand the full complexities of human fertility. Even though the techniques they recommended, like pessaries or herbal remedies, might have had some effect, they were far from perfect and weren't guaranteed to work. Another interesting aspect of Roman medicine and contraception is the philosophical debates that arose about reproduction and the human body. Some Roman thinkers, such as Cicero, believed that preventing pregnancy was unnatural and went against the divine order of things. To them, contraception was something that went beyond mere medical intervention. It was a moral issue that raised questions about the sanctity of life and the role of men and women in the process of reproduction. On the other hand, there were also Roman thinkers who believed that controlling fertility was a necessary part of maintaining a healthy society. They saw contraception as a practical solution to the problems of overpopulation, poverty, and economic strain. It was viewed as a way to keep families manageable and ensure that women could maintain their health and well-being without the constant strain of childbearing. These differing views on contraception, whether as a moral issue or a pragmatic solution, reflect the complex attitudes Romans had toward reproduction, sex, and family life. In the end, while Roman physicians made significant strides in understanding reproduction and developing early forms of contraception, it's clear that their methods were based on an incomplete scientific understanding of the body. However, they did lay the groundwork for future medical advancements, and their contributions to gynecology and reproductive health continued to influence medical thought for centuries. As we continue our exploration of contraception in ancient Rome, it's time to take a closer look at something that often gets overlooked in the history books: the social and cultural significance of contraception. In a society as complex as ancient Rome, contraception wasn't just about personal health or reproductive control. It was a reflection of the broader social dynamics, gender roles, and moral codes that defined Roman life. And the more we dive into this topic, the more we realize just how deeply entwined contraception was with Roman identity and societal values. To begin with, let's examine the gender roles in Roman society, as they played a massive part in shaping attitudes toward reproduction and contraception. In ancient Rome, men held most of the power, both in public and private spheres. Roman men were expected to father children, especially male heirs, in order to continue the family name and carry on the lineage. The ability to produce legitimate heirs was a point of pride, and childbearing was seen as part of a woman's primary role in society. But while Roman men were expected to control reproduction to some extent, women's roles in this process were far more complicated. Women, especially those in the elite classes, were expected to bear children for their husbands. However, as we've seen throughout history, women didn't always have the luxury of deciding how many children they wanted to have. In fact, their ability to control family size often depended on the decisions of their male relatives, particularly husbands and fathers. Contraception, while somewhat available, was often not within the control of the woman herself. This is where things start to get culturally interesting. Roman women, especially those in the upper classes, were often surrounded by the expectation of motherhood and contraception became a tool for them to balance the pressure to reproduce with the need to maintain their own well-being. Elite Roman women had the luxury of choosing when to have children, but this choice was often constrained by social expectations and the moral codes of the time. For these women, contraception wasn't just about avoiding pregnancy, it was also about status. The ability to control one's fertility, to prevent unwanted pregnancies, and to limit the number of children was, in many ways, a luxury. It was a way for upper-class women to maintain their position in Roman society without being overwhelmed by constant childbirth. In this sense, contraception wasn't just a personal matter, it was a social marker, a sign that a woman had the means to control her body and, by extension, her social role. But, as we've seen with lower-class women and slaves, contraception had a very different significance. For these women, especially those of the lower classes or in servitude, contraception wasn't about luxury or social status. It was about survival, about being able to maintain control over their own bodies in a society where they had little to no agency. Contraception for these women was often a means of ensuring they didn't have too many children, so they could continue working or maintain their health. In fact, some lower-class women were so desperate to control reproduction that they would turn to anything they could find, whether it was herbal remedies, magical spells, or even barrier methods like sponges soaked in vinegar. They didn't have access to the well-established medical care or the herbal remedies that elite women might have had. Instead, their contraception was often based on practicality, using whatever was available to prevent pregnancy and keep their families manageable. In the world of Roman brothels, the situation was even more stark. Prostitutes and women working in the sex trade were commodities, often used for the pleasure of Roman men. As we've seen earlier, they had to use contraception not just to avoid pregnancy, but to protect their livelihoods. But in addition to this, these women were subject to a whole host of moral judgments and legal constraints. Despite the fact that prostitution was legalized in Rome, the women who worked in brothels were still seen as low status and their bodies were treated as property. For them, contraception was a tool for survival, a way to protect their health and ensure they could keep working. This brings us to an important and often uncomfortable truth. Contraception was, in many ways, linked to a woman's social value. For some women, contraception was about protecting their health and well-being. For others, it was about maintaining control over their reproductive destiny. Yet, for many, it was a necessity, a way to avoid pregnancy in a world where reproduction was often not just a personal choice, but a social obligation. Interestingly, while contraception played a key role in Roman society, it was also a subject of moral debate. Moralists and philosophers in Rome often grappled with the question of whether contraception was ethically permissible. Some, like Cicero, believed that preventing pregnancy was against the natural order, while others, like Augustine, condemned it as a form of selfishness or even sin. For these thinkers, contraception wasn't just a medical or practical issue, it was a moral one. To them, interfering with reproduction was a violation of divine will, a transgression of the natural process. Yet, despite these moral debates, contraception was still a practical reality in ancient Rome, even if it wasn't always talked about openly. It was something that both men and women from different walks of life engaged with in different ways, depending on their social status, gender, and the moral codes they adhered to. Contraception in ancient Rome wasn't just about stopping pregnancy, it was tied up with larger questions of power, control, agency, and social order. In many ways, these cultural attitudes toward contraception shaped how future generations would view birth control, family planning, and sexual freedom. The Roman approach to contraception wasn't just a medical practice, it was part of a much larger cultural conversation about the roles of men and women, the sanctity of life, and the moral implications of controlling fertility. As we take a step back from this historical narrative, we can see that, despite the oddness and primitive nature of some of the methods, ancient Rome was already grappling with many of the same issues we face today when it comes to reproduction and contraception. The question of who gets to decide when and how reproduction occurs. As we dive even deeper into the world of ancient Roman contraception, let's take a step back and think about the legacy these practices left behind. The fascinating thing about ancient Rome is that, despite their lack of modern technology and scientific understanding, the Romans laid the groundwork for many of the concepts and methods we now take for granted in the realm of family planning. It's like they were conducting the first experiments in contraceptive science, albeit without all the advanced knowledge and tools we now possess. While the ancient Romans didn't have access to the pill, IUDs, or condoms as we know them today, their resourcefulness and experimentation with herbs, barriers, and rituals helped to shape the cultural attitudes toward reproductive control that we see in later societies. The Romans understood that fertility was a key aspect of social life, and in many ways, their efforts to control it marked a pivotal point in history. One of the most significant aspects of Roman contraception was its influence on later cultures. After the fall of the Roman Empire, many of the philosophical ideas and medical practices surrounding fertility continued to reverberate through the Middle Ages and Renaissance. In fact, the church and religious thinkers during the medieval period often debated the morality of contraception, drawing from ancient texts like those of Galen and Soranus. These early medical writings became some of the primary sources for later physicians and scholars as they explored birth control in new ways. However, the Christian Church, with its strong influence on Western society, viewed contraception as a moral issue. Unlike the Romans, who had a more pragmatic approach to birth control, the Church viewed any attempt to interfere with procreation as sinful. The idea of natural law, which was championed by religious thinkers, often clashed with the more pragmatic, medical approach that the Romans had embraced. For centuries, medieval and Renaissance societies saw little progress in contraception, partly due to these religious objections. But the seeds of contraceptive knowledge that were sown in ancient Rome did not disappear. As the centuries progressed, physicians, herbalists, and even lay people continued to experiment with various methods to prevent pregnancy. While the religious and moral debates continued to rage, people still found ways to use herbal remedies, barrier methods, and even rudimentary surgical techniques, all rooted in the knowledge passed down from the Roman era. Fast forward to the 19th and 20th centuries, when the scientific and medical communities finally began to unlock the mysteries of human reproduction. It was then that modern contraception truly began to take shape, with the invention of the condom, the development of birth control pills, and the creation of IUDs. Yet, if you look closely, many of the principles behind these modern methods are rooted in the trial and error that the Romans began over 2,000 years ago. Now, let's consider the cultural legacy left by Roman contraception. The Romans didn't just experiment with herbs and physical barriers, they also influenced the cultural understanding of sexuality and gender roles. For Romans, sex wasn't just about reproduction, it was also about pleasure, power, and social status. Contraception allowed people, especially women, to enjoy sex without the constant fear of unwanted pregnancy. And for men, contraception provided a sense of freedom, a way to engage in sexual activity without the responsibility of fathering too many children. In many ways, the Roman experience with contraception helped to pave the way for later attitudes towards sexual freedom and family planning. While Roman society was undoubtedly patriarchal, with women often having little control over their reproductive choices. The existence of contraceptive practices in ancient Rome still represents an early form of agentia, a sign that people were seeking ways to manage their fertility in a world that was often hostile to personal choice. The legacy of Roman contraception also reveals just how resilient human beings are when it comes to controlling reproduction. Despite living in a world without modern medicine or technology, the Romans understood that having children was not only a personal matter, it was also a social and economic one. By developing a variety of methods to control fertility, they created a framework that would influence societies for millennia to come. It's interesting to think about how much has changed since the days of the Roman Empire. Today, we have an entire industry dedicated to contraception, from pills and patches to permanent surgical options. But the Roman methods, no matter how strange or rudimentary they may seem to us now, were the early experiments that laid the foundation for the scientific advancements that would follow. And then there's the cultural shift that occurred. In modern times, contraception has become a fundamental right, empowering individuals to take control of their reproductive health. Women, in particular, have gained more access to birth control, giving them the ability to make choices about their bodies and their futures. In many ways, the ancient Roman desire for control over reproduction lives on in the modern world, though with far more sophisticated tools and a much broader societal acceptance. But we mustn't forget that these advancements didn't come easily. For centuries, contraception was a battleground fought not only in medical and scientific circles, but also in moral, cultural, and political arenas. The struggle for sexual freedom, reproductive rights, and gender equality has been long and ongoing. While much progress has been made, the history of Roman contraception serves as a reminder that the quest for control over fertility is not a new phenomenon. It's a battle that has been fought for millennia. As we reflect on the Roman legacy, it's easy to see how their experiments with contraception have influenced not just the course of medical history, but also the cultural, social, and moral frameworks we navigate today. The methods may have been imperfect, the beliefs may have been rooted in superstition, but the desire to control fertility, to manage reproduction, and to understand the intricacies of human biology was something the Romans got right, even if only in its infancy. In the end, the legacy of ancient Roman contraception is about more than just methods and materials. It's about the human drive to understand and control one of life's most basic processes, a drive that continues to shape the modern world in ways that the Romans could never have imagined. As we move closer to the end of this fascinating journey through ancient Roman contraception, let's explore the cultural impact of these methods on society at large and their influence on modern contraception. The legacy of Roman contraception is more than just an intriguing historical curiosity. It is a testament to the ingenuity and resourcefulness of the ancient world, and a reflection of humanity's long-standing desire to control reproduction. The Roman Empire was undoubtedly a society of contradictions. On the one hand, it was built on the foundation of a highly structured social hierarchy, strict gender roles, and a moral code that prioritized family lineage and reproduction. On the other hand, the very same society showed remarkable flexibility and creativity in addressing the complexities of reproduction and family planning. In this way, Roman contraception became a space where private needs intersected with public concerns, especially as the empire expanded and diversified. One aspect of Roman society that influenced contraception practices was the view on sexuality. While sex was undeniably seen as a social duty, particularly in marriage, it was also viewed as a means of pleasure and power. Roman men, in particular, were not only encouraged to father children, but also to engage in sexual pleasure with slaves, concubines, and prostitutes. This casual relationship between sexuality and reproduction led to the need for contraception, as it allowed for sexual freedom without the unintended consequence of an ever-expanding family. In this sense, contraception was a tool for social control, enabling individuals to participate in Roman life without necessarily contributing to the already high birth rate. This dynamic, where sexuality and reproduction were compartmentalized, mirrored the hierarchical nature of Roman society. Men had the freedom to pursue sexual pleasure without fear of consequences, while women, especially those of lower social classes or slaves, had to find ways to survive within these constraints. Contraception for women was often a means of empowerment in a world where much of their agency was restricted. While elite women might have more control over their fertility, it was the lower-class women and slaves who were most likely to turn to the underground practices that made contraception more accessible. But it wasn't just women who relied on contraception. Men also had a stake in the development of these methods. Roman men were deeply concerned with the legacy they left behind, often preferring to have children from their legitimate wives, while maintaining sexual relationships outside of marriage. Contraception allowed men to fulfill their sexual desires without the burden of excessive reproduction. The use of condoms made from animal intestines or other natural materials is an example of how Roman men attempted to exercise sexual autonomy while keeping reproduction under control. The fact that these early methods of contraception were often male-controlled is a reminder of the patriarchal nature of Roman society. Despite these gendered power dynamics, contraceptive practices were not confined to the elite or to one particular social group. The diversity of methods used by Romans, from herbal remedies to physical barriers, from magical rituals to medical treatments, show how universal the desire to control reproduction was. This was not an issue for only a few. It was a widespread need that transcended social and economic boundaries. So, what does this mean for modern society? While Roman contraception may seem crude by today's standards, many of the ideas they experimented with laid the groundwork for future advancements. From the use of barriers to the concept of regulating fertility through herbs, their experimentation opened the door to the more refined methods we have today. Take, for instance, the modern-day IUD. While the ancient Romans didn't have access to advanced technology to create an intrauterine device, they used pessaries, physical objects inserted into the vagina, to block sperm. In a sense, this was an early version of the barrier methods we now consider common. Similarly, the use of herbal remedies for menstrual regulation or fertility control finds its modern parallel in hormonal birth control and other medicinal contraceptive methods that allow individuals to control their reproductive health. Furthermore, Roman practices contributed to the cultural shift surrounding contraception. Today, the right to contraceptives is considered a basic part of sexual autonomy and reproductive rights. While the Romans may have approached contraception with an eye toward practical solutions and moral constraints, their experiments with fertility control contributed to the wider conversation on personal choice, reproductive health, and gender equality. These issues continue to dominate the political and cultural landscape today, as society grapples with the ethical and practical questions of who controls reproduction. Interestingly, the debates in ancient Rome about morality and natural law around contraception are not so different from modern-day debates about the ethics of birth control and family planning. The moral objections raised by Roman philosophers like Cicero and Augustine are echoed in the arguments of modern-day critics of contraceptive methods. These ethical debates continue to shape policies around reproductive rights and access to contraception in many parts of the world. In some ways, the Roman experience with contraception serves as a reminder that the question of who controls reproduction is not new. It's an issue that has been central to human society for millennia. The methods may have changed, the materials may have evolved, but the core question remains: who gets to decide when and how reproduction happens? In examining the legacy of Roman contraception, we can see that while much has changed in terms of technology and medical knowledge, the fundamental issues surrounding reproduction, gender, and power continue to be relevant today. The Romans, in their own way, helped lay the groundwork for the modern conversation about family planning, reproductive rights, and sexual freedom. Their innovative use of herbs, barriers, and even magical rituals may seem primitive in hindsight, but they were an early expression of the same desire to control fertility that drives much of the modern world today. And while we may no longer rely on crocodile dung or vinegar-soaked sponges, the Romans' search for methods of contraception shows how deeply embedded the desire for reproductive autonomy has always been in human history. As we look toward the future, we can take inspiration from the Roman drive for innovation, realizing that the quest for reproductive control is as ancient as humanity itself. As we approach the final stages of our exploration into ancient Roman contraception, it's time to reflect on one last, crucial piece of the puzzle: the cultural significance of contraception in Roman society and how it shaped their broader worldview. You see, while we've spent a lot of time discussing the practical, physical methods used by the Romans, there's an entire layer of meaning and symbolism embedded in how they viewed contraception and reproduction. In general, that goes beyond herbs, sponges, and magical spells. The Roman Empire was a society built on order, and much of this order was rooted in the family unit. The pater familias, or the head of the family, was the ultimate authority in Roman households, and his power extended to the reproductive decisions within his family. Having children was seen not just as a biological function, but as an essential part of maintaining social structure and status. Families that had many heirs could ensure the continuity of their wealth and influence, while those who failed to reproduce effectively could lose their social standing. Contraception, therefore, wasn't merely a medical practice, it was deeply intertwined with the larger goals of preserving social order. Yet, despite this social pressure to produce offspring, the use of contraception also hinted at a more personal, private struggle: the tension between individual desires and societal expectations. In a world where families were often expected to grow quickly, and where a large number of children could both help and hinder one's life, contraception became a way to assert a degree of control over one's future. For elite Roman women, who had more freedom to manage their own bodies and fertility, contraception was an expression of individual agency. It allowed them to navigate the complex balance between fulfilling their roles as mothers and wives, while also maintaining a sense of personal autonomy. What makes Roman contraception even more fascinating is how it reveals the contradictions in Roman attitudes toward sexuality. Romans had a relatively liberal view of sexuality compared to many other ancient cultures. Sex, after all, was not only for reproduction, but for pleasure and power. Roman men, especially those in the upper classes, were expected to engage in sexual activities outside of marriage, often with slaves and prostitutes. Yet, despite this widespread sexual freedom, there was still a pervasive sense of moral obligation to control reproduction. For men, contraception was often about preserving their own pleasure while avoiding the complications that come with fathering too many children. For women, it was about managing family size in a world where an overabundance of children could become a burden rather than a blessing. In fact, gender dynamics played a huge role in how contraception was perceived and practiced. While men were often the ones to decide the terms of reproduction, women were the ones who bore the physical, emotional, and social consequences. Roman women were frequently objectified when it came to reproduction, seen as vessels for producing heirs, but also as individuals who could assert some level of control over their fertility. For many women in the lower classes, especially slaves and prostitutes, the control of reproduction was often a matter of survival. Their bodies were viewed as commodities either for labor or for sexual work, so contraception wasn't just about personal choice. It was about maintaining their livelihood and ensuring they could continue working without the interruption of pregnancy. In contrast, elite Roman women were often afforded more agency in their reproductive choices. While they, too, had to adhere to social expectations, they had access to better medical care, higher quality herbal remedies, and a network of support that allowed them to exercise more control over when and how they had children. Still, even these women were subject to the moral codes of Roman society, which stressed the importance of maintaining a good reputation and ensuring the continuation of the family line. Contraception, then, was often a tool of social strategy, used to align with Roman ideals of family, wealth, and social position. The complexity of these gender dynamics is compounded by the fact that religion also played a central role in how Romans approached reproduction and contraception. Roman gods and goddesses were deeply involved in all aspects of daily life, including matters of fertility. Juno, the goddess of marriage and childbirth, was invoked for blessings related to conception and childbirth, while Venus, the goddess of love, played a more sexualized role in the lives of Romans, symbolizing the pleasures and passions that came with sex. In a society so deeply tied to religious practice, invoking divine protection or blessings through rituals and amulets was an essential part of many Roman women's approach to contraception. Yet, despite these cultural and religious beliefs, contraception was also deeply practical. In a society where medical care was limited and where many women had little control over their fertility, contraception became a way for the marginalized like slaves and prostitutes to assert some control over their lives. The reliance on herbal remedies, barrier methods, and even magical spells served as an act of self-preservation in a world where reproductive health was tied not only to personal well-being, but also to survival within the harsh social structure of Rome. The moral debates around contraception in ancient Rome echo those in modern societies. Just as ancient moralists like Cicero argued against contraception, seeing it as unnatural or immoral, many modern critics of birth control also see it as interfering with the natural course of reproduction. However, just as the Romans found ways to work within their social systems and engage in pragmatic contraception practices, modern societies have also navigated the balance between morality and personal freedom. Today, contraception is largely seen as an individual choice, a way to empower individuals, particularly women, to decide when and how they want to have children. The journey of contraception, from ancient Rome to the modern day, illustrates a continuous struggle for autonomy and the right to decide one's own reproductive future. It is clear that Roman contraception laid the groundwork for the cultural and ethical discussions we continue to have today about reproductive rights, sexual freedom, and family planning. The Roman legacy is not just one of trial and error in terms of medicinal practices, but also one of cultural experimentation. The Romans sought solutions for their society's complex needs, experimenting with everything from herbal remedies to rituals to physical barriers. Their attempts at contraception reflected their larger societal goals, managing social order, maintaining family wealth, and preserving individual autonomy within a rigid class structure. In the end, we find that ancient Roman contraception was not just a set of methods for avoiding pregnancy, was a reflection of social values, moral beliefs, and the complex relationship between personal choices and societal expectations. In a sense, their struggles with reproduction echo many of the same challenges we face today as we navigate the intersection of autonomy, ethics, and family planning. As we reach the final chapter of our exploration into the world of Roman contraception, let's take a moment to reflect on the profound influence the Romans had on the development of contraceptive practices and their impact on modern society. While ancient Rome is often remembered for its grand architecture, military conquests, and political machinations, it is just as crucial to understand how Roman society shaped ideas that have echoed throughout the centuries, especially when it comes to the control of reproduction. The methods that the Romans experimented with, though crude by modern standards, were pioneering in many ways. They were among the first to combine natural remedies, physical barriers, and even magical rituals to address the fundamental need for fertility control. In doing so, they laid the groundwork for future societies to recognize the significance of reproduction not only as a biological event, but as a social and cultural matter of great importance. But beyond the methods themselves, what stands out most is how the Romans used contraception as a way to balance individual autonomy with the broader societal needs. They understood that in order to manage the vast Roman Empire, there needed to be systems in place to regulate population growth, maintain family lines, and ensure social stability. At the same time, Roman women, especially those of higher social standing, found ways to navigate the confines of their prescribed roles, asserting a level of control over their bodies and fertility. Yet, for the lower classes and slaves, contraception was often not about personal choice, but about survival and maintaining health in a world where the body was subject to the whims of masters, clients, and society. For these individuals, contraception was often a desperate measure to avoid the burden of too many children, and yet it was just as crucial a part of their daily lives as it was for the elite. The duality between choice and necessity in Roman society underscores the deep inequality that existed at the time. What's also fascinating is how these practices reflected the cultural values of Rome. The Roman view of fertility and family was far from straightforward. On one hand, fertility was viewed as a social duty, a way to ensure the continuity of family lines and the Roman state. On the other hand, fertility control allowed the Romans to navigate the personal complexities of reproduction, enabling individuals to engage in sexual activity without the constant fear of unwanted pregnancy. Religion, too, played a significant role in shaping Roman attitudes toward contraception. The belief that gods like Juno, Venus, and even Priapus could influence a woman's fertility reveals just how intertwined the divine and the physical were in the Roman worldview. These religious practices provided comfort and a sense of control in a world where so much of life was dictated by forces beyond human understanding. As we look at the evolution of contraception in modern society, the journey from ancient Rome to the present day is a tale of progress, struggle, and, at times, resistance. While we no longer rely on methods such as crocodile dung or vinegar-soaked sponges, the principles that underpinned Roman contraception, the desire to control fertility, the quest for personal agency, and the need for social regulation remain at the heart of the ongoing conversation about reproductive rights. In modern times, contraception has become a fundamental human right, a key part of women's autonomy and empowerment. From the birth control pill to IUDs, from condoms to sterilization procedures, the variety of methods available today is a direct result of centuries of experimentation, trial and error, and intellectual debate that dates back to the very first attempts to manage reproduction in ancient Rome. The work of Roman physicians like Soranus and Galen, and even the folk remedies used by lower-class women, contributed to the knowledge and practices that would eventually lead to the development of modern contraceptive methods. And just as the Romans had to grapple with the moral implications of contraception, debating its ethics and its place in society, so too do we continue to confront these issues today. The conversations about reproductive freedom, gender equality, and access to contraception are ongoing, with many societies still wrestling with questions of who controls reproduction, who has access, and how it fits into broader social, cultural, and political frameworks. The struggles and progress of Roman society laid the foundation for our current discussions, even as we continue to seek new solutions and methods. Ultimately, the story of Roman contraception is a story of innovation, adaptation, and necessity. The methods may have been rudimentary, and the beliefs may seem strange to us today, but the Romans were undeniably ahead of their time in recognizing the importance of controlling fertility. In their own way, they provided an early framework for understanding and addressing the complex relationship between sexuality, reproduction, and social order that continues to resonate in the modern world. As we reflect on the lessons we've learned from ancient Rome, we realize that the path toward modern contraceptive practices was not linear. It was marked by cultural shifts, scientific breakthroughs, and social struggles. The Romans were not just experimenting with plants and herbs, they were experimenting with society itself, exploring how to balance personal freedom with the needs of a larger civilization. Their legacy continues to shape our world today, reminding us that the fight for reproductive autonomy, sexual freedom, and gender equality is a battle that has been fought for millennia, and one that will continue long into the future. As we close the chapter on ancient Roman contraception, remember that the journey is far from over. The lessons of the past continue to inform our modern challenges, and the quest for understanding and control over reproduction is a story that spans both history and humanity itself.